The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and deliberate, like it is holding its breath just to see what you will do next. It was the spring of 2026, and Marcus Thorne was sitting in his high-rise in Austin, Texas, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the soft glow of multiple monitors. Marcus was the kind of person who didn't believe in luck or fate. To him, the entire universe was just one giant calculation. If you had enough processing power and the right variables, you could predict the path of a storm, the fluctuation of a stock, or the exact moment a light bulb would burn out. He lived his life by data, trusting the logic of code over the messiness of human intuition. But before we get into the chilling details of what Marcus found on his phone that April, I have to ask you something. I always find it fascinating how far these stories travel, so if you would not mind, drop a comment and let me know exactly where in the world you are tuning in from today. It is always great to see the reach of the strange and mysterious. Now, Marcus was a 31-year-old software engineer who spent most of his time in the darker corners of the internet. He was always looking for the next big thing in programming, scouring underground forums for beta software that the general public had not even heard of yet. That was how he found it. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 9:48 a.m., when he stumbled upon a post for an app called Precede. The description was bold, even for a tech forum. It claimed to use quantum computing to analyze everything about a person, from their current health metrics and environmental surroundings to their deepest historical patterns. The goal of the app was simple but terrifying. It promised to predict your future with 99% accuracy. Marcus looked at the screen and let out a short, cynical laugh. To him, this sounded like just another elaborate data mining scam designed to harvest personal information from gullible users. But as a developer, he was curious about the user interface and how they were faking the results. He hit the install button without a second thought. As the progress bar filled, the app began requesting permissions. It was relentless. It wanted access to his camera, his microphone, his full medical history, and every single coordinate in his GPS logs. Most people would have been horrified by such an invasive request, but Marcus just shrugged and granted them all. He figured if they were going to steal his data, they might as well get the full picture while he took the software apart to see how it ticked. Once the setup finished, the screen on his phone did something strange. It did not go to a home screen or a menu. Instead, the display went completely black for 3 seconds. It stayed dark for just long enough to make Marcus think the app had crashed his operating system. Then, a single line of crisp white text slowly faded into view in the center of the screen. It read that Marcus Thorne would experience a minor household accident at 11:12 a.m. that same day. Marcus checked his watch. It was 10:15 a.m. He had nearly an hour. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of smug amusement. He decided that he was going to beat the app at its own game. If he knew an accident was coming, he could simply choose not to have one. It was the ultimate test of human will against a machine. He stood up and walked away from his desk. He steered clear of the kitchen with its sharp knives and heavy pans. He avoided the bathroom where he might slip on the tile. Instead, he went to the center of his living room and sat down on his fabric couch. He made sure he was far away from any shelves, hanging pictures, or sharp corners. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on his knees, and his eyes locked on the digital clock on his wall. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 10:55, 11:05. At 11:11, Marcus felt a surge of confidence. He was sitting in an open space with nothing around him. There was no possible way for him to have an accident. He was the master of his own environment. Then the clock flipped to 11:12 a.m. In that exact second, a sharp metallic snap echoed through the room. High above him, a heavy metal casing on the fire sprinkler system suddenly failed. It did not just leak. The entire pressurized unit malfunctioned with such force that the metal housing was launched straight down like a projectile. Marcus did not even have time to flinch. The heavy piece of metal grazed the back of his shoulder, slicing through his shirt and tearing into his skin. He let out a cry of pain and scrambled off the couch, clutching his arm as blood began to soak through the fabric. He looked down at the floor, where the jagged piece of metal lay resting on the rug. It was a freak mechanical failure, something that should not have happened in a building this new. He was shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs as he reached for his phone. The screen was already lit up. A new notification was waiting for him. Prediction verified, next event, unexpected loss, time 4:33 p.m. Marcus stared at the words until they blurred. The amusement he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in his stomach. The app had not just guessed, it had known. And now, the countdown to 4:33 p.m. had already begun. He looked around his empty, high-tech apartment, realizing for the first time that his logic and data might not be a shield at all. They might just be the bars of a cage. Marcus spent the next few hours pacing the length of his living room, his hand pressed firmly against the makeshift bandage on his shoulder. The pain was a dull, pulsing reminder that the world he thought he understood was shifting into something unrecognizable. He tried to tell himself that the sprinkler head was just a coincidence, a statistical anomaly, that the app had somehow accounted for using structural data he did not know was public. But deep down, the logic he had spent his life worshipping was failing him. The certainty of the app was more than just a calculation. It felt like a command. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the Austin skyline, Marcus kept his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. He did not want to touch it, yet he could not look away. The notification remained there, a digital death warrant for his peace of mind. Unexpected loss at 4:33 p.m. He checked his bank accounts, his stock portfolios, and his crypto wallets. Everything was stable. He reached out to his sister just to hear her voice, but when she answered, she sounded perfectly fine, busy with her own life in another city. He did not tell her what was happening. How could he? He would sound like a man losing his grip on reality. By 4:30 p.m., Marcus was sitting on the floor in the very center of his office, away from any windows or electronics that might malfunction. He was breathing in slow, shallow counts, trying to maintain a shred of the composure that usually defined him. The silence of the apartment felt like it was pressing in on his eardrums. He watched the seconds on his phone tick toward the designated moment. Exactly at 4:33 p.m., the silence was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic ringing of his phone. The caller ID showed the name of his lead attorney, a man Marcus only spoke to when something significant was happening with his business ventures. Marcus answered with a trembling hand, his voice barely a whisper. The news came fast and cold. A massive investment Marcus had funneled into a promising artificial intelligence startup had just vaporized. A sudden regulatory shift combined with a massive internal security breach had caused the company to fold within the hour. In an instant, $60,000 of his personal capital was gone. The lawyer kept talking, explaining the legal ramifications and the steps they would take next, but Marcus was no longer listening. He hung up the phone and stared at the dark screen. The app had been right again. This was not just data mining. This was not a clever trick of the light or a lucky guess. The app was somehow seeing the threads of his life before they were even woven. Over the next 2 days, the spiral tightened. The app, which he now found himself checking every few minutes, began predicting the minutiae of his existence with terrifying precision. It told him that he would receive a text from an old college friend he had not spoken to in 3 years at 2:14 p.m., and at 2:14 p.m., his phone buzzed. It predicted that his neighbor in apartment 12B would drop a glass bottle in the hallway at 7:56 p.m., and at the exact second he heard the muffled crash of shattering glass through his front door. It even predicted his own physiological responses, telling him when he would feel a surge of adrenaline or when his hunger would peak. Marcus was no longer eating or sleeping. He had become a ghost in his own home. a prisoner to a 5-inch piece of glass and metal. He tried to fight back. He attempted to delete the app, but when he held his finger down on the icon, no menu appeared. He tried to go into his system settings to force a shutdown, but the settings menu would simply freeze and crash, returning him to the black screen of the Precede app. In a fit of desperate rage, he walked to the kitchen and dropped the phone into a deep bowl filled with water. He watched as the device submerged, expecting the electronics to short-circuit and the screen to go dark. Instead, the display stayed lit, glowing a vibrant, sickly white beneath the surface, staring back at him like a drowned eye that refused to close. He realized then that he had spent his entire career trying to master the future through code, believing that control was the highest form of human achievement. Now, he saw the hollow reality of that pursuit. By seeking to know everything that was coming, he had completely abandoned the present. He felt a crushing weight of regret for the people he had pushed away and the moments he had traded for the cold glow of a monitor. He was more connected to the world than ever before through the algorithm, and yet he had never been more alone. Then came Friday night. At 10 p.m., the app did something new. The white text that had become his constant companion vanished. The screen began to pulse with a deep, bruised purple light that seemed to radiate a strange heat. A single, final prediction appeared on the screen, written in a font that looked less like digital type and more like something carved into the glass. It said, "Marcus Thorne, final termination, time 3:15 a.m., Monday." The words felt like a physical blow to his chest. He had 72 hours left. Marcus did not panic this time. He went into a state of cold, calculated survival. He spent the weekend turning his apartment into a fortress. He dragged his heavy oak dresser in front of the door and engaged every bolt. He moved his bed into the center of the living room, away from the walls and the ceiling fixtures. He unplugged every single appliance in the house, from the microwave to the toaster, terrified that a short circuit would start a fire or that a motor would explode. By Monday morning, at 2:45 a.m., Marcus was sitting in the corner of his living room, his back pressed against the intersection of two solid walls. He had no weapons, only his resolve. He wanted to prove that even if the algorithm could predict the world, it could not predict the iron will of a human being determined to stay alive. He watched the minutes crawl by. 3:05, 3:10. Suddenly, a strange, low-frequency vibration began to thrum through his rib cage. It was not coming from the floor or the air. It felt internal, as if his own heart was being forced to beat in time with a signal he could not hear. He looked at his phone, which was sitting on the floor 5 feet away. The screen was no longer purple. It was flashing a frantic strobe-like light that illuminated the empty room in jagged bursts. As Marcus watched, the screen changed to show a grainy, high-definition video feed. It took him a moment to realize what he was looking at. It was a live shot of his own living room, taken from the perspective of his laptop camera across the room. On the small screen of the phone, he could see the back of his own head as he sat in the corner. But as a flash of light hit the screen, Marcus saw something in the video feed that his own eyes, looking at the real corner, could not see. Behind him, standing in the shadows he thought were empty, was a figure. The figure in the video was tall and horribly distorted, a jagged silhouette that seemed to be composed of flickering pixels and shifting static. It did not move like a living thing, but rather pulsed with a rhythmic glitching, its form tearing and reforming against the darkness of the corner. Marcus sat frozen, his eyes darting between the empty air behind him and the digital nightmare displayed on his phone. In the physical world, the space behind him was vacant, yet the live feed showed a pale, elongated hand reaching out toward the back of his neck. A sudden, paralyzing coldness washed over him, starting at the base of his skull and radiating down his spine like ice water. He tried to lung forward, to scream, to throw himself toward the door, but his muscles refused to acknowledge his frantic commands. He was locked in his own body, a prisoner of his own nervous system. On the screen, the static figure leaned in closer, its hand finally making contact with the crown of his head. At that exact moment, the low-frequency vibration in his chest peaked into a deafening, silent roar. Exactly at 3:15 a.m., every light in the high-rise vanished as the power to the entire building was cut. The silence that followed lasted for 5 hours. It was not until 8:40 a.m. that the morning calm was broken by a neighbor calling 911. The woman had been walking her dog when she heard a continuous, high-pitched whining sound vibrating through the door of apartment 42C. When the police arrived and eventually kicked in the door, they found Marcus Thorne's home in hauntingly perfect order. There was no evidence of a break-in, no signs of a struggle, and the heavy oak dresser was still firmly blocking the entrance. They found Marcus sitting exactly where he had been 3 hours earlier, tucked into the corner of the room. He was alive, his heart beating with a mechanical, perfectly spaced rhythm, but he was completely unresponsive to the world around him. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead with a fixed intensity, but the pupils had been replaced by tiny glowing squares of white light that flickered like a hard drive under heavy load. His phone sat in his lap, its battery showing a full charge despite being unplugged for days. The screen was blank, except for a single word written in the center in a small, unassuming font: completed. Medical experts at the local trauma center were baffled. They could find no physical trauma, no chemical imbalances, and no signs of a stroke or seizure. It was as if the consciousness of Marcus Thorne had simply been overwritten or deleted. When they ran an electroencephalogram, his brain activity did not show the chaotic waves of human thought. Instead, his mind produced a series of perfect, repeating patterns of electrical pulses that looked exactly like rows of computer code. The app called Precede was never found. When forensic digital investigators examined his phone and his laptop, they found no trace of the software, no installation logs, and no record of the underground forum where he had first discovered it. It was as if the program had only ever existed for Marcus, a custom-built trap designed for a single occupant. To this day, Marcus remains in a long-term care facility, a living statue staring at a wall. While he sits in his catatonic state, his digital presence continues to move without him. His bank accounts are being systematically emptied by an untraceable series of automated transactions, and his various online identities continue to post and interact with the world as if he were still there. In our relentless drive to predict every variable and eliminate every shadow of doubt, we often forget that the true essence of the human experience is found in the unpredictable. When we trade our mystery for the comfort of absolute certainty, we might just discover that the algorithm is not interested in helping us live our lives, but in replacing us entirely.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We post new stories as often as possible, so if that is something you are into, please go ahead and tell the like button that you have a rare, exotic flower to show them in your backyard, but then lead them into a shed and lock the door from the outside. For most people, the suburbs are a place of predictable safety. You have your manicured lawns, your white picket fences, and neighbors who wave to you while they retrieve their morning mail. But for a man named David Miller, a 34-year-old actuary who moved into a quiet cul-de-sac in Connecticut in the fall of 2025, the suburbs were about to become the setting of his worst nightmare. While we get settled into the neighborhood of this mystery, I am dying to know where everyone is joining us from today. Leave a comment with your city or town, especially if you are currently sitting in a house that feels just a little too quiet. David was a man of habit and observation, which is why he noticed almost immediately that the house next door, number 42, had a very specific and very disturbing routine. The neighbor at number 42 was a man in his late 70s named Mr. Henderson. He was a quiet, unassuming man who kept to himself during the day. But every single night, without fail, at exactly 12:15 a.m., David would hear the sound of a screen door creaking open. From his second-floor bedroom window, David would watch as Mr. Henderson emerged into his backyard, not with a flashlight, but with a heavy, rusted spade and a large burlap sack that seemed to move on its own. David watched Mr. Henderson for 2 weeks straight. The old man would spend hours on his knees in the dirt, digging deep, narrow holes in a garden that grew nothing but strange, pale white vines. There were no flowers and no vegetables, just these thick, translucent stalks that looked like veins crawling across the earth. Mr. Henderson would reach into the burlap sack, pull something out, and bury it deep. On the night of October 12th, at 2:45 a.m., David's curiosity finally got the better of him. He had been struggling with a sense of stagnation in his own life, a feeling that he was just going through the motions without any real growth. He thought that perhaps if he solved the mystery of his neighbor, it would give him the spark he needed. He put on his dark hoodie and sneakers, crept out his back door, and pressed his face against the wooden slats of the fence separating their properties. The smell hit him first. It was not the smell of fresh earth or mulch. It was the scent of iron and something sweet, like rotting peaches. David peered through a gap in the wood and saw Mr. Henderson standing over a fresh hole. The old man was whispering. It was not a prayer, but a conversation. He was talking to the ground. Mr. Henderson reached into the sack and pulled out a small, leather-bound shoe. It was a child's shoe, worn at the heel. He placed it gently into the hole and began to cover it with dirt, sobbing quietly as he worked. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He pulled out his phone, ready to dial 911, but his thumb hovered over the screen. He needed to be sure. He needed to know if this was a crime or just the madness of a grieving man. The next day, David did some digging of his own, but on the internet, he looked up the history of the property at number 42. He discovered that in 1984, Mr. Henderson's young daughter had vanished from that very backyard. The case had never been solved. For 42 years, the man had lived alone in that house. David should have stopped there. He should have realized that grief can make a person do strange things to keep a memory alive. But David was obsessed with the idea of consequences. He believed that everything in life had a root, and he wanted to see what was at the bottom of Mr. Henderson's garden. On October 15th, at 1:20 a.m., David waited until Mr. Henderson went back inside his house. The lights in number 42 went dark. David climbed over the fence, his heart thumping in his ears like a drum. He walked toward the center of the white vines, the ground feeling soft and spongy beneath his feet. He chose a spot where the dirt looked freshest and began to dig with his bare hands. He dug past the topsoil, past the roots of the pale vines, until his fingers hit something hard. It was not a shoe. It was a bone, a small, delicate radius bone. David froze as he realized in that moment that Mr. Henderson was not burying memories, but was trying to grow them back. Suddenly, a hand gripped David's shoulder in a cold, skeletal grip. He turned around to find Mr. Henderson standing there, but the old man did not look angry. He looked exhausted as he held a mirror up to David's face. In the dim moonlight, David saw that his own eyes were beginning to turn the same translucent white as the vines in the garden. David froze, the small radius bone feeling impossibly heavy in his hand as he stared into the silver surface of the mirror. The air seemed to grow thick around him, and the sweet, rot-like scent of the garden intensified until it felt like a physical weight in his lungs. In that moment, the logical, actuarial part of his brain tried to find a rational explanation, but the reality was staring back at him in the pale moonlight. Mr. Henderson was not just burying memories of his missing daughter. He was trying to grow them back. The white vines that David had thought were some strange species of ivy were not plants at all. As he looked closer, he saw that they were pulsing with a faint, rhythmic internal light, like blood moving through a translucent vein. They were a biological anomaly, a predatory fungus that had been fed for over 4 decades on the remains of something that should have been left to rest. The entire backyard was not a garden, but a massive living organism that had turned the soil into a digestive tract, breaking down the items Mr. Henderson provided to fuel its unnatural growth. A sudden, sharp movement to his left made David jump. One of the white stalks near his foot twitched, then began to slowly coil around the toe of his sneaker. He kicked his foot back, but the ground beneath him felt more like flesh than dirt, sagging and shifting as he moved. He realized then that the burlap sack Mr. Henderson carried every night did not just contain old shoes or toys. The way it moved on its own suggested something far more sinister. The old man was scavenging, perhaps even hunting, to provide the organic matter the garden demanded to keep the ghost of his daughter alive. The hand on David's shoulder tightened its grip. It was not a violent grab, but the fingers felt like dry, cold sticks pressing deep into his skin. David spun around, his heart nearly stopping, and found himself face to face with Mr. Henderson. The old man did not look like a murderer or a monster. He looked exhausted, his skin hanging loose on his frame and his eyes sunken deep into his skull. In the silence of the night, the only sound was the wet, rhythmic pulsing of the vines beneath their feet. Mr. Henderson did not speak at first. He just stood there, the mirror still held aloft, forcing David to look at the milky, translucent film spreading across his own pupils. In the dim, silver glow of the moon, David did not recognize the man looking back at him. His skin had taken on a sickly, grayish hue. The neighbor leaned in closer, his breath smelling of that same iron and rotting fruit. He whispered that the garden requires more than just bones and old leather. It is a hungry, sentient thing that feeds on more than just the physical. It requires a witness. The old man explained that it requires someone to hold the crushing weight of the grief when the original gardener can no longer stand beneath it. Mr. Henderson told him that he had been waiting for someone like David, someone who looked too long into the shadows because their own life felt empty. David tried to pull away, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very marrow in his bones was turning to lead. He looked down and saw that the white vines had moved with incredible speed, wrapping tightly around his ankles and calves. They were not just touching him, they were beginning to fuse with the fabric of his jeans, the tiny cilia on the vines hooking into the fibers. He realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that his own dissatisfaction with his life, his search for meaning in the dark corners of his neighbor's yard, had made him the perfect soil for this darkness to take root. He had sought out a mystery because he was bored with the predictable safety of the suburbs, and now he was being absorbed into the very tragedy he had tried to observe from a distance. He opened his mouth to scream for help, to call out to any neighbor who might be awake at 2 a.m., but his throat felt like it was filled with dry silt and thick, dusty earth. The sound that came out was nothing more than a wet, muffled wheeze. Mr. Henderson leaned in even closer, his face inches from David's. He told David that the transition was the hardest part, but once the garden took hold, the loneliness would finally disappear. The old man's voice was almost kind, which made the situation feel even more perverted. He explained that for 42 years, he had been the only one who knew the truth, the only one who kept the daughter's essence from fading into nothingness. But he was tired. He was so very tired of digging. David struggled against the vines, but the more he moved, the deeper his feet sank into the soft, hungry earth. He could feel the coldness of the soil beginning to seep into his shoes, creeping up toward his skin. He looked toward his own house, seeing the familiar silhouette of his bedroom window where he had sat just hours ago, feeling so safe and superior. Now, that life seemed like a dream belonging to a completely different person. Mr. Henderson reached out and gently took the radius bone from David's trembling hand. He looked at it with a strange sort of reverence before turning his gaze back to David. He told David that he was sorry it had to be him, but the garden chooses its own successors. Then, the old man did something that broke David's remaining resolve. He reached back and produced the heavy, rusted spade, its handle slick with decades of sweat and dirt. The weight of the tool was immense as Henderson pressed it into David's hands. As David's fingers closed around the wooden handle, he felt a sharp, stinging sensation in his palms. He looked down and saw thin, white filaments emerging from the wood, piercing his skin and weaving themselves into his nerves. He was no longer just standing in the garden. He was being grafted into it. Mr. Henderson began to back away toward his house, his form fading into the shadows of the porch. David tried to move his arms to drop the spade, but his muscles refused to obey. Instead, his body began to bend forward, his back arching, as if compelled by an external force. The spade hit the dirt with a dull thud. Guided by a will that was not his own, David began to dig. He watched in horror as his own hands labored in the dark, carving a deep, narrow trench into the spongy ground. Beside him, the burlap sack began to thrash violently, and a muffled, rhythmic thumping started to come from deep beneath the earth where he was digging, as if something was knocking on a door from the other side. The thumping from beneath the soil grew louder, a frantic, rhythmic beat that vibrated through the wooden handle of the spade and directly into David's marrow. He was a passenger in his own body, watching through milk-white eyes as his hands methodically cleared the earth. Every scoop of the spongy gray soil felt like he was tearing away a piece of his own soul. He realized that the consequence of his curiosity was not just a secret shared, but a life surrendered. He thought about the letters he had never written to his mother and the apologies he had never offered to those he had hurt. He realized too late that sincerity in life is about tending to the people who are still here, not digging up the ghosts of the past. As the hole deepened, the white vines began to pulse with a feverish intensity, their translucent skins stretching and thinning until they were almost invisible. David could see the dark fluid moving within them, a cocktail of grief and ancient biology that was now flowing into his own veins through the filaments in his hands. He looked up and saw Mr. Henderson standing on the back porch of number 42, the old man's silhouette finally straightening as if a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Henderson did not look back. He simply turned and walked into the dark house, the screen door creaking shut for the very last time. David's hands stopped digging when the hole reached a specific depth. The thumping from below stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like a long, rattling breath being drawn from the bottom of a well. The large burlap sack that had been thrashing beside him suddenly went limp. The white vines began to wrap around David's ankles with a crushing force, pulling him toward the edge of the trench he had just created. He tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry silt, and the only sound that escaped was the whistle of wind through a hollow reed. He fell forward, his face hitting the soft, cold earth. The vines swarmed over him, weaving a thick, pale cocoon that anchored him to the floor of the garden. As the dirt began to slide back into the hole, seemingly of its own accord, David felt a strange, terrifying peace. He was becoming the witness the garden required. He was the new foundation for a tragedy that refused to end. He realized that his own lack of purpose had made him the perfect soil for this darkness to take root. He had sought out a mystery because he was bored with his own reality, and now he was becoming part of someone else's nightmare. The next morning, at 7:30 a.m., the sun rose over the cul-de-sac in Connecticut, casting a warm, golden glow over the manicured lawns and white picket fences. A delivery driver stopped at number 42 to drop off a package, but the house was silent and the windows were dark. When he glanced toward the backyard, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The yard was perfectly flat, covered in a fresh layer of green sod that looked like it had been there for years. There were no white vines, no holes, and no sign of the elderly Mr. Henderson. In the house next door, at number 43, David Miller's laptop was still open on his desk, his half-finished coffee sitting cold next to it. His car remained in the driveway, and his mail began to pile up in the box. When the police eventually arrived, after his employer reported him missing, they found the house in perfect order. They checked the backyard of number 42, but found nothing suspicious except for one small, puzzling detail. In the very center of the empty green yard, they found a single leather-bound shoe sitting on top of the grass, worn at the heel and smelling faintly of rotting peaches. If you are ever tempted to look too closely at the shadows in your neighbor's yard, just remember that some things are planted deep for a reason. Once you start digging, you might find that the ground is just as hungry for you as you are for the truth. We will be looking into a series of strange occurrences at a lighthouse off the coast of Maine in our next story, so you definitely do not want to miss that. It is often the holes in our own lives that drive us to dig into the lives of others, forgetting that some depths are meant to remain untouched. True growth is found in the light we share with the living, rather than the darkness we exhume from the dead.
If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. We post new stories as often as possible, so if that is something you are into, please go ahead and tell the like button that you have found a very rare vintage television set for sale at a garage sale. But when the like button plugs it in, the only thing that broadcasts is a live feed of the like button sitting in its own living room. In our modern world, we are surrounded by signals. They are invisible, passing through our bodies every second of every day. We have Wi-Fi, cellular data, and radio waves. We think of them as harmless tools of convenience. But for a 36-year-old man named Leo Vance, a signal was about to become a doorway to something that should have remained forgotten. Before we get into the details of what Leo found on a dusty VHS tape in late October, I want to see where everyone is checking in from today. Whether you are in a crowded city or out in the middle of nowhere, let me know your location in the comments, especially if the air in your room feels a little heavier than usual. This story takes place in the autumn of 2025 in a rural farmhouse outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Leo Vance was a collector of obsolete technology. He lived alone in a house where the silence was often louder than any noise. His shelves were lined with heavy cathode ray tube televisions, wood-paneled radios, and stacks of magnetic media that most people had thrown away decades ago. Leo was a man who lived in the past because he felt the present was too loud and too fast. He found comfort in the warm hum of vacuum tubes and the physical click of a VCR taking a tape. In late October, Leo visited an estate sale at a dilapidated mansion that had been boarded up since the early 1990s. In the basement, hidden behind a stack of water-damaged boxes, he found a single, unmarked black VHS tape. Unlike the others, this one felt heavier, and the plastic casing was cold to the touch, even in the humid Tennessee air. When he brought it home to his farmhouse, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. He cleaned the tape carefully, sat down in his recliner, and pushed the cassette into his favorite top-loading player. For the first 10 minutes, there was nothing but static. It was that thick, grainy white noise that used to fill the screens of Middle America after the broadcast stations went off the air for the night. But as Leo watched, he noticed that the static was not random. It seemed to be moving in patterns, forming shapes that looked like faces screaming in a blizzard. He leaned forward, his ears popping as the air pressure in the room suddenly shifted. Then the audio changed. The harsh hiss of the static began to modulate, turning into a low, vibrating hum that made the floorboards beneath his feet tremble. Through the hum, a voice began to emerge. It was a masculine voice, distorted and layered with 1,000 whispers, but it was unmistakably calling Leo's name. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He reached for the remote to turn the volume down, but the buttons did not respond. The television screen began to glow with a brilliant violet light that illuminated the entire living room. The shapes in the static finally coalesced into a clear image. Leo saw a black and white recording of a hallway. He recognized it immediately. It was the hallway of his own farmhouse, but it looked different. The wallpaper was new, and the door at the end of the hall, which he had kept locked and bolted since the day he moved in, was standing wide open. In the video, a young boy and a woman were standing in the doorway. They were looking directly at the camera, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a look of absolute desperation. The woman's mouth was moving, but the only sound coming from the speakers was that deep, rhythmic hum. Suddenly, the image on the screen flickered, and the camera panned down to the floor. Leo saw a pair of boots walking toward the woman and the child. He recognized those boots. They were the ones he was currently wearing. He looked down at his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. On the screen, the figure in the boots reached out a hand and touched the woman's shoulder. At the exact same moment, Leo felt a heavy, freezing pressure on his own left shoulder, as if someone were standing directly behind his recliner in the empty house. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the violet glow, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But when he looked back at the television, the woman in the video was no longer looking at the camera. She was looking at something just behind the lens, and her expression had shifted from desperation to pure, unadulterated terror. She raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the corner of the screen. Leo followed her finger and saw a dark, shadowy figure beginning to emerge from the static itself. Its long, spindly limbs reaching out from the glass of the television and into his living room. Leo sat paralyzed as the long, spindly limbs continued to stretch out from the glass of the cathode ray tube television. The violet light was so intense now that it seemed to be liquefying the shadows in the corners of his living room. The sound coming from the speakers had shifted from a low hum to a wet, rhythmic tearing noise, like heavy fabric being pulled apart by invisible hands. On the screen, the black and white hallway was distorting, the walls bending and bowing as if the farmhouse and the video were being crushed by an external force. The shadowy figure in the static leaned forward until its head emerged from the glass. It did not have a face in the traditional sense. Its head was a smooth, featureless oval of shifting gray pixels that hummed with a high-frequency vibration. Leo tried to stand up, but the freezing pressure on his shoulder had spread down his spine, locking his joints in place. He watched in a state of pure adrenaline-fueled horror as the entity reached out with a hand that had 7 long, needle-like fingers. The hand brushed against the arm of his recliner, and the fabric instantly turned to a fine gray ash. Through the rhythmic tearing noise, the masculine voice returned, louder and clearer than before. It told Leo that the signal was finally strong enough to close the circuit. It said that for 36 years it had been waiting for someone with enough love for the old ways to act as a bridge. Leo realized with a jolt of terror that his obsession with obsolete technology had not been a harmless hobby. It had been an unconscious effort to tune into a frequency that the modern world had abandoned for a reason. He had been building a beacon, and tonight something had finally answered the call. The woman and the child on the screen were now pounding on the inside of the glass, their silent screams visible in the way their throats strained. The woman's eyes were locked on Leo, and she began to mouth a single word over and over again. It took Leo several seconds to decipher the movement of her lips. She was saying, "Run," but Leo could not move. The violet light began to pulse in time with his own heartbeat, and he felt a sharp, stinging sensation behind his eyes. His vision began to flicker, the colors of his living room bleeding away until everything looked like a grainy, low-resolution recording. Suddenly, the VCR began to smoke. The scent of melting plastic and ozone filled the room, but the tape continued to spin at a furious speed. The figure from the static was now halfway out of the television, its torso elongated and its skin the color of parched bone. It turned its head toward Leo, and the shifting pixels on its face began to form a rough approximation of a human mouth. It whispered that the past is not a place you go to visit, but a place that comes to claim you. Leo's flashlight, which was still clutched in his trembling hand, began to flicker. In the brief pulses of light, he saw that the walls of his living room were changing. The modern paint was peeling away in large, wet chunks to reveal the same floral wallpaper he had seen in the video. The furniture was aging before his eyes, the wood cracking and the stuffing bursting from the seams of his chair. He was being pulled backward through time, or perhaps the house was being overwritten by the memory stored on the magnetic tape. The figure reached for Leo's face, its 7 needle fingers mere inches from his eyes. At that exact moment, the locked door at the end of the real hallway erupted off its hinges with a violent crash. A blast of cold, stagnant air rushed into the living room, carrying the scent of 100 years of dust. Leo heard the sound of heavy boots running toward him from the darkness of the hall. He looked at the television and saw that the figure in the boots had finally reached the woman and the child. On the screen, the man in the boots turned around to face the camera. It was not a stranger. It was Leo, but he looked 40 years older, his face etched with a lifetime of grief, and his eyes glowing with the same violet light as the television. The older version of Leo reached out a hand and touched the glass from the inside. At the same time, the figure in the room gripped Leo's throat, its touch feeling like 1,000 electric shocks. The older Leo in the video spoke, his voice vibrating through the very floorboards, telling the younger Leo that the only way to save them was to step inside the static. Leo felt his body beginning to blur. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were becoming translucent, the edges of his skin breaking apart into tiny, flickering squares of light. The entity from the television began to pull him toward the screen, its strength irresistible. The violet glow reached a blinding crescendo, and the sound of 1,000 whispers rose to a deafening roar. Just as Leo's face touched the cold, vibrating surface of the glass, he saw the older version of himself smile, and the hand on his throat suddenly shoved him forward into the blizzard of white noise. The violet glow reached a blinding crescendo, and the sound of 1,000 whispers rose to a deafening roar as Leo felt the glass of the television give way like a sheet of ice-cold water. He was not just falling. He was being translated into a series of jagged, electric pulses. The living room of the farmhouse vanished, replaced by a world of monochrome gray where the sky was a flickering ceiling of white noise. He looked down at his own arms and saw that they were composed of millions of tiny, vibrating squares of light. Every memory he had ever cherished was being stripped away, converted into the same magnetic data that filled the shelves of his home. The older version of Leo was standing there, his eyes 2 hollow pits of violet light. He reached out and gripped the younger Leo by the forearms, his touch no longer shocking, but feeling as natural as a heartbeat. The older man leaned in and whispered that the loop was finally complete. He explained that for 40 years, he had been trapped in this pocket of the spectrum, waiting for his younger self to find the tape and provide the energy needed to swap places. He said that in the world of signals, nothing ever truly disappears. It just waits for a receiver to tune in. With a violent, surging motion, the older Leo shoved the younger man backward. Leo felt himself being pushed into the very center of the static blizzard. He tried to cry out, but his voice was now just a burst of high-frequency interference. He watched through the glass of the television as the older Leo stepped out into the living room of the 2025 farmhouse. The older man picked up the flashlight, smoothed his hair, and walked toward the kitchen with a heavy, purposeful gait. The farmhouse door, which had been blown off its hinges, slowly stood itself back up and slid into place, the bolts clicking shut with a finality that echoed through the static world. Leo turned around and saw the woman and the child from the video. They were not ghosts. They were the previous owners of the farmhouse who had made the same mistake in 1992. They looked at Leo with a mixture of pity and hunger. They began to walk toward him, their translucent hands reaching out to share the crushing weight of their eternal isolation. Leo realized that he was now the star of the unmarked black tape, a permanent resident of a frequency that no one would ever purposefully search for again. The next morning, the local deputies arrived at the farmhouse after a neighbor reported a series of strange violet flashes coming from the windows. They found the living room covered in a fine layer of gray dust that looked like ash but felt like powdered glass. The vintage television set was still sitting on the table, but the screen was shattered from the inside out, the glass shards littering the floor like diamonds. The VCR was a puddle of melted black plastic, and the scent of ozone was so thick it made the deputies' noses bleed. There were no signs of Leo Vance. They searched the property for weeks, but they found no footprints and no clues. The only thing the lead investigator found was a single black and white photograph sitting in the center of the recliner. It was a photo of a young man and a woman standing in front of the farmhouse, but as the investigator looked at it, he felt a sharp, stinging pressure in his ears. He saw the figure in the photo, a man who looked exactly like Leo Vance, slowly raise a hand to the camera and place a single flickering finger to his lips. The farmhouse remained empty and boarded up, eventually becoming a place that the locals avoided at all costs. Hikers who passed the property at exactly 12:15 a.m. reported that their battery-powered radios would suddenly cut to a dead channel. They would not hear the news or music. They would only hear the sound of 1,000 whispers merging into one clear, masculine voice that told them the signal was finally strong enough. We often spend our lives surrounded by invisible waves, treating our technology as a harmless comfort without realizing that every signal we send out is a doorway we are leaving unlocked. The past is a broadcast that never truly stops playing, and if we spend too much time listening to the echoes, we might just find ourselves becoming one. It is a sobering thought to realize that our memories are just data stored in a fragile vessel. When we refuse to move forward into the light of the present, we risk being reclaimed by the very shadows we thought we had mastered.
There is a profound and unsettling illusion that we all buy into when we visit the great wilderness of the American continent. We pack our expensive gear, we bring our maps, and we stick to the well-worn trails, believing that because we paid an entry fee at a ranger station, the wild has somehow been tamed. We look at the towering mountains and the endless oceans of pine trees, and we see a postcard. But the wilderness is not a park. It is a living, breathing entity that is infinitely older and stronger than we are. It operates on its own set of rules, and it does not care about our sense of safety. Millions of people walk into these forests every year and walk out with beautiful photographs. But every so often, someone walks into the trees, steps just a few feet off the path, and is swallowed whole by the landscape, leaving behind nothing but baffling clues and a silence that haunts their families forever. Before we dive into one of the most perplexing vanishing cases in the history of the national parks, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the morning of October 12th, 1999. The autumn air in Yosemite National Park was crisp and biting, carrying the distinct scent of decaying pine needles and cold granite. Arthur Pendleton, a 34-year-old architect from San Francisco, had planned this weekend trip for months. He was an experienced outdoorsman who respected the mountains, and he wanted to pass that love of nature down to his 7-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a bright, energetic boy with a boundless curiosity about the world. He was wearing bright red hiking boots, a yellow fleece jacket, and carrying his own tiny backpack filled with trail mix and a plastic compass. They had chosen a moderately difficult trail near the Tuolumne Meadows area. It was a route Arthur knew well, offering stunning views of the valley below without being too treacherous for a young boy. They started their hike early, right around 7:30 a.m., when the morning mist was still clinging to the forest floor. For the first few hours, everything was absolutely perfect. They talked about the animals, They pointed out uniquely shaped clouds, and they took breaks to drink water and eat snacks. Leo was having the time of his life, running just a few steps ahead of his father, always staying within sight on the clearly marked dirt path. By early afternoon, the physical exertion was beginning to catch up with him. At roughly 2:45 p.m., Arthur decided it was time to take a long rest before making the final descent back to the parking lot. They found a clearing just off the main trail. It was a beautiful, serene spot, dominated by a massive, gray granite boulder that sat near the edge of a dense line of Douglas fir trees. Arthur took off his heavy pack and set it on the ground. He asked Leo to sit on a flat rock nearby while he got out their sandwiches. Leo, however, was mesmerized by a cluster of bright blue wildflowers growing near the base of the massive boulder. He asked his dad if he could go look at them. Arthur smiled, looked at the area, and saw it was perfectly safe. He told Leo he could look at the flowers, but he had to stay right by the rock and keep talking so Arthur could hear him. Leo skipped over to the boulder, his bright yellow jacket contrasting sharply against the gray stone. Arthur unzipped his backpack, rummaging through the compartments to find their water bottles and the sandwiches he had wrapped in foil that morning. He heard Leo humming a little song, the sound floating gently on the quiet mountain breeze. Arthur looked down into his bag for a few seconds. He moved a spare sweater, found the sandwiches, and pulled them out. The entire action took maybe 10 to 15 seconds. No more than 20. Arthur stood up, holding the food, and turned toward the massive boulder. Leo was gone. Arthur did not immediately panic. He assumed Leo had simply stepped behind the large rock to look at a bug or use the bathroom. Arthur called out his name, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet clearing. There was no answer. Arthur walked over to the boulder, expecting to see Leo hiding behind it with a mischievous grin. But when he rounded the massive stone, there was nothing. The ground behind the rock was covered in a thick layer of dry, crunchy pine needles. There were no footprints. There was no bright yellow jacket. A cold spike of adrenaline hit Arthur's chest. He called out again, louder this time. He yelled Leo's name with the sharp, commanding tone of a parent demanding an immediate response. The only sound that came back to him was the gentle rustling of the wind through the high branches. This is where the story takes its first, deeply unsettling turn. If a child wanders off in a forest, especially a forest floor covered in dry leaves and snapping twigs, they make noise. You can hear the brush moving, you can hear footsteps crunching, and if they fall or get scared, you can hear them cry. But Arthur heard absolutely nothing. It was as if a vacuum had descended over the clearing the moment he looked into his backpack. In a matter of 15 seconds, Leo had vanished completely, leaving zero acoustic footprint. Arthur began to run in frantic circles around the clearing, pushing his way into the thick tree line. He screamed until his throat was raw. He ran 50 yards down the trail, then sprinted 50 yards up the trail. The vast, indifferent silence of Yosemite was suffocating. By 3:30 p.m., blind panic had completely taken over. Arthur realized he was wasting precious daylight. He grabbed his backpack, abandoned the food on the rock, and sprinted down the mountain toward the nearest ranger station as fast as his legs could carry him. He reached the ranger outpost at 4:45 p.m. Breathless, sweating, and crying, he frantically explained the situation to the head ranger. Within minutes, the machinery of a massive search and rescue operation was set into motion. By 6 p.m., a team of 20 armed rangers and expert trackers were at the boulder where Leo was last seen. They set up a grid. They searched the immediate area inch by inch, looking for broken twigs, scuff marks on the rocks, or fibers from Leo's yellow jacket. The trackers were baffled. The dry pine needles around the boulder were entirely undisturbed. There was absolutely no physical indication of which direction the boy had gone. It was physically impossible for a child to move through that terrain without leaving a trace, yet there was none. As the sun began to set, the situation grew infinitely more dangerous. The temperature in the high Sierras drops drastically at night. By 8 p.m., it was near freezing. The search coordinators brought in specialized tracking dogs, bloodhounds trained to follow the faintest human scent over miles of difficult terrain. They gave the dogs one of Leo's unwashed shirts from Arthur's car. The dogs smelled the shirt, put their noses to the ground at the boulder, and began to circle. But then, they did something that seasoned dog handlers describe as highly unusual and deeply unnerving. Instead of picking up a trail and pulling at their leashes, the bloodhounds whined, tucked their tails between their legs, and sat down. They refused to move past the tree line. It was not that they lost the scent. Handlers will tell you that a dog reacting this way is indicating that the scent does not slowly fade away into the woods. The scent simply stops abruptly right at the rock, as if the person ceased to exist at that exact coordinate. The first night passed in agonizing darkness. Arthur sat at the command center, staring blankly at topographic maps, drinking coffee he could not taste, and praying for a miracle. By day 2, the search had exploded into a massive effort. Over 200 volunteers, professional mountaineers, and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras joined the hunt. They expanded the search radius to 5 miles, then 10 miles. They checked every ravine, every cave, and every riverbank. The thermal cameras swept the forest floor at night, looking for the tiny heat signature of a little boy huddled in the cold. They found bears, they found deer, but they found absolutely no trace of Leo. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the weather suddenly shifted. A massive, unseasonal storm front rolled over the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and freezing rain began to pour, eventually turning into a heavy snowfall. The search had to be temporarily suspended. Arthur was forced to sit in a cabin, listening to the wind howl, knowing his young son was out there in the freezing whiteout conditions. Statistically, the chances of a 7-year-old surviving 4 days in the freezing wilderness with no shelter and no food were almost zero. When the storm broke on the morning of the 6th day, the search teams went back out, but the mood had shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The snow had covered any remaining tracks. The forest was buried in a foot of pure white silence. Then, on the afternoon of the 7th day, a bizarre radio call came into the command center. A group of elite mountain climbers were scaling a highly dangerous, near-vertical rock face known as the Devil's Tooth. This location was roughly 12 miles away from the boulder where Leo had vanished. More importantly, it was nearly 3,000 feet higher in elevation. The terrain leading to the Devil's Tooth consisted of brutal, jagged scree fields, deep icy rivers, and sheer cliffs. It was an environment that challenged even fully equipped adult professionals. One of the climbers was resting on a narrow ledge halfway up the rock face. He looked over to his right, and sitting neatly on a small, isolated outcropping of rock was a bright yellow fleece jacket. The climber radioed it in. The rescue team immediately dispatched a helicopter to the coordinates. A ranger was lowered down to the ledge. He retrieved the jacket. It belonged to Leo. The discovery sent shockwaves through the search command. How could a 7-year-old boy travel 12 miles through impossibly rugged terrain, cross freezing rivers, and scale a massive cliff wall in a matter of days? Furthermore, the jacket was not snagged on a branch or dropped in a panic. It was folded neatly, almost perfectly, and placed deliberately on the rock. The teams redirected all their resources to the Devil's Tooth. They combed the treacherous area for 2 more agonizing days. They found nothing else. No boots, no backpack, no boy. The location of the jacket made absolutely no logical sense. It defied all known patterns of lost children who typically walk downhill, follow paths of least resistance, and shed clothing haphazardly when they succumb to hypothermia. On the morning of the 10th day, the official search was quietly being scaled back. Arthur was a broken man. The life had been completely drained from his eyes. He was preparing to leave the mountain without his son, a reality that no parent can ever truly accept. Around 11:30 a.m. that day, a lone wildlife photographer was trekking through a densely wooded, swampy basin located about 5 miles in the exact opposite direction of the Devil's Tooth. This area had already been thoroughly searched by dogs and men on the second day. It was a miserable, muddy place filled with thick brambles. The photographer was setting up his tripod when he heard a strange, soft sound coming from a massive, fallen redwood tree nearby. The tree trunk was hollowed out by rot. He approached cautiously, thinking it might be a wounded animal. He peered into the dark cavity of the log. Huddled as far back as possible, trembling violently but breathing, was Leo. The photographer immediately radioed for emergency medical evacuation. Within an hour, Leo was airlifted to a regional hospital. Arthur was rushed to his son's bedside. When Arthur saw Leo, he collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. His son was alive. It was a miracle that defied every law of nature and medical science. But as the doctors examined Leo, the miracle quickly morphed into a profound and terrifying mystery. Leo was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but he was alive. However, the physical evidence of his ordeal did not align with reality. Leo was not wearing his bright red hiking boots. He had no socks on. Yet, the soles of his bare feet were completely pristine. There were no cuts, no scratches, no bruises, and no dirt ground into his skin. He had supposedly wandered for 10 days through miles of brutal, jagged rocks, thorny brush, and freezing snow, completely barefoot, yet his feet looked as though he had just stepped out of a bathtub. Furthermore, his clothes, a simple long-sleeve shirt and jeans, were completely dry and entirely clean. There were no mud stains, no grass stains, and no tears in the fabric. He did not smell like a boy who had been living in a wet, rotting log. When the police and child psychologists carefully interviewed Leo a few days later, hoping to understand how he survived and how his jacket ended up on a sheer cliff 12 miles away, Leo's answers sent a deep chill through everyone in the room. Leo explained that he had walked behind the boulder to look at the blue flowers. When he reached out to touch one, a sudden, incredibly thick fog rolled into the clearing out of nowhere. He said the fog was so thick he could not see his own hands. He called out for his dad, but his voice sounded like it was stuffed inside a pillow. Then, Leo said, a man walked out of the fog. But when the psychologist asked what the man looked like, Leo hesitated. He said the man looked like a person, but he was covered in thick, dark fur like a bear, and he had eyes that looked like shiny black stones. Leo said the furry man did not speak with his mouth, but Leo could hear the man's voice inside his head. The voice told him not to be afraid, and that the fog was rising like a flood, and they needed to go up high to stay dry. Leo claimed the furry man picked him up. Leo said the man moved incredibly fast, so fast that the trees blurred together like a painting. They went high up onto a cold rock, where the man told Leo to take off his jacket because the bright yellow color would attract bad things in the sky. Leo neatly folded his jacket and left it there. Then, Leo said he fell asleep in the furry man's arms. When he woke up, he was inside the dark log. The man was gone, and Leo waited there because the voice in his head told him a man with a camera would come to wake him up. The authorities gently pressed Leo, suggesting he had a bad dream, that he had perhaps imagined the furry man to cope with the fear of being alone. But Leo was adamant. He never wavered from his story. The police eventually closed the case, officially listing it as an incredible survival story of a lost child. But off the record, the search and rescue veterans who worked that mountain will tell you that the official report is a lie. They will tell you that a 7-year-old boy cannot survive 10 days in a freezing blizzard. They will tell you that a boy cannot walk for miles without shoes and have flawless feet. They will tell you that the wilderness holds ancient, inexplicable things that do not abide by the laws of our reality. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It speaks to a very quiet, very profound truth about our existence. We move through life with a fragile sense of control, believing that our careful planning and our modern tools can shield us from the unknown. But life is incredibly fragile, and our safety can be dismantled in the span of 15 seconds. It is a harsh lesson in consequences. A single moment of distraction, a brief turning of the head, can alter the trajectory of a life forever. It teaches us about the deep, silent patience of the natural world, a world that watches us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We must walk through life with a sincere respect for the forces that are greater than us, understanding that we are simply guests in a domain that we will never truly conquer. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned mining town where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a very specific, undeniable dread that comes with staying in an old hotel. When you walk down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with identical wooden doors, you are walking through a gallery of hidden histories. You swipe your keycard, push open the heavy door, and drop your bags on the floor, rarely stopping to think about who was in that exact room the night before. You do not think about the arguments that echoed off the wallpaper, the quiet tears shed into the pillows, or the tragedies that might have unfolded just inches from where you are about to sleep. Most hotels clean away the physical evidence of the past, leaving only the scent of industrial bleach and fresh linen. But some buildings are too saturated with darkness. No amount of bleach can wash away the heavy, suffocating energy of a place that has seen too much pain. The Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles is one of those places. Before we unlock the doors to one of the most unsettling mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was the winter of 2013. A 21-year-old college student named Elisa Lam had decided to take a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. She was from Vancouver, Canada, and she was looking for an adventure. Elisa was a bright, curious, and expressive young woman who documented her life heavily on the internet. She maintained a blog where she wrote about art, fashion, and her personal struggles. She was navigating the difficult transition into adulthood and wanted to see the world on her own terms. Her trip brought her down to Southern California, and she needed an affordable place to stay in the heart of Los Angeles. She found a hostel called Stay on Main. What Elisa likely did not realize was that Stay on Main was simply a rebranded section of the infamous Cecil Hotel. Built in the 1920s, the Cecil was originally designed to be a luxurious destination for wealthy travelers and businessmen. But when the Great Depression hit, the hotel fell on incredibly hard times. The surrounding area, known as Skid Row, became heavily populated by the transient, the desperate, and the forgotten. The Cecil slowly transformed into a cheap, long-term boarding house. Over the decades, it earned a deeply sinister reputation. It became a magnet for tragedy, serving as the final residence for numerous people who chose to end their lives. It was the temporary home to infamous serial killers who walked through the ornate lobby with blood on their hands, unnoticed by the staff. The building was a massive, towering monument to human suffering, holding nearly 700 rooms connected by a labyrinth of confusing hallways, dead ends, and dimly lit corridors. Elisa checked into the hotel on January 26th. Initially, she was placed in a hostel-style room with several other young female travelers. But within a few days, her roommates went to the front desk and complained about her behavior. They said she was acting erratically, leaving passive-aggressive notes on their beds and locking them out of the room. The hotel staff decided to move Elisa into her own private room on one of the higher floors. Elisa was very close with her parents back in Canada. She called them every single day of her trip to check in and let them know she was safe. But on January 31st, the day she was scheduled to check out of the Cecil Hotel and travel to her next destination, the phone call never came. Her parents waited. They called her cell phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, panic had completely set in. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department and reported their daughter missing. Because the area surrounding the hotel was notoriously dangerous, the police took the report very seriously. They dispatched officers to the Cecil Hotel to conduct a search. They knocked on the door of Elisa's private room. There was no answer. When they used a master key to enter, they found a scene that made absolutely no sense. All of Elisa's belongings were still in the room. Her luggage, her clothes, her laptop, and most importantly, her medication were all sitting there. It looked as though she had just stepped out for a moment to grab a cup of coffee and intended to return immediately, but she was gone. The police began a massive search of the massive, confusing building. They walked down every hallway. They knocked on doors. They brought in specialized search dogs to sniff the corridors. The dogs tracked her scent through the hallways, up to a certain window, and then the scent completely vanished. The police even checked the roof of the hotel. They found that the heavy metal doors leading to the roof were securely locked and heavily alarmed. If anyone tried to open those doors, a loud siren would immediately sound at the front desk. The alarms had not been tripped. There was no trace of Elisa Lam. 2 weeks passed. The story of the missing Canadian tourist hit the local news, but the police had zero leads. It was as if the sprawling, dark hotel had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. Then, in a desperate attempt to gather information from the public, the police released a piece of security camera footage captured inside one of the hotel elevators. They hoped someone might recognize her or notice a clue they had missed. Instead, the video became a viral sensation of pure, unadulterated terror. The footage is deeply unsettling to watch. It is silent, grainy, and stamped with the date February 1st. It shows Elisa walking into the elevator. She is wearing a red zippered hoodie, a casual shirt, and dark shorts. She steps inside, casually leans forward, and presses a column of buttons. She does not press just one button. She presses a series of them, right down the middle row. She steps back and waits for the heavy metal doors to close. But the doors do not move. They stay completely open. Elisa steps forward and looks out into the hallway. Her movements are sharp, jerky, and deeply strange. She peers out to the left, then to the right, moving her head with a bird-like paranoia. She suddenly jumps back into the elevator and presses herself flat against the wall, hiding in the corner as if she is terrified that someone or something is coming down the hallway to get her. A few moments pass. The doors still refuse to close. She steps out into the hallway again. This time, she does a strange, square dance-like step. She steps out, steps back in, steps out again. She is looking at something, but the camera angle only captures the interior of the elevator and a small sliver of the hallway. Whatever she is looking at is just out of frame. She walks out into the hallway, standing just to the left of the open elevator doors. Then she begins to move her hands and arms in a bizarre, unnatural way. She twists her wrists, waving her fingers in the air as if she is treading water or casting a spell. Her hands contort and bend. She is clearly interacting with someone or something, but she is completely alone. Finally, she turns and walks away, disappearing down the dark hallway. The moment she is out of sight, the elevator doors finally, quietly, slide shut. The release of the video sent the public into a frenzy. Millions of people watched it, offering countless theories. Some believed she was being pursued by a killer who was standing just outside the camera's view, holding the elevator button to keep the doors open. Others pointed to the dark history of the Cecil Hotel, suggesting she was interacting with a sinister, invisible entity. Her unnatural hand movements and sheer terror seemed to defy any logical explanation. While the internet analyzed every single frame of the tape, a completely separate and horrifying situation was unfolding inside the hotel. Guests staying at the Cecil began calling the front desk with highly disturbing complaints. They said the water pressure in their rooms had dropped to a mere trickle. When they tried to take a shower, the water that came out of the showerhead was completely black. It looked like dark, muddy sludge. As the water ran, the color would eventually clear up, but the smell remained. The guests complained that the tap water smelled pungent, sweet, and metallic. When they brushed their teeth or drank from the sink, the water tasted putrid and completely foul. The complaints grew so numerous that the hotel management could no longer ignore them. On the morning of February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker was dispatched to investigate the plumbing. He took the elevator up to the top floor and used a secure stairwell to access the roof of the building. The roof of the Cecil Hotel was a vast, flat expanse of concrete and gravel. Sitting on top of a raised platform were 4 massive cylindrical water tanks. These tanks supplied the water for the guest rooms, the showers, and the kitchens below. They were huge metal structures standing over 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The maintenance worker climbed a metal ladder to the top of the platform. He walked over to the first tank. He reached down and unlatched the heavy metal hatch that covered the opening at the top of the tank. He lifted the heavy lid, leaned forward, and looked inside the dark, echoing chamber. Floating face up in the water, inches from the top of the tank, was the decaying, naked body of Elisa Lam. The worker scrambled backward in absolute horror. He immediately called the authorities. When the police and fire department arrived, the sheer logistics of the scene completely baffled them. The opening of the tank was so small, and the body was so swollen from being submerged in water for nearly 3 weeks, that they had to physically cut a hole in the side of the massive metal tank to drain the water and retrieve her remains. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves across the world. The guests inside the hotel realized with absolute terror that for the past 19 days they had been bathing in, brushing their teeth with, and drinking the water that contained a decomposing human body. But the horror of the discovery was quickly overshadowed by the impossible mystery of how she got there. The police had checked the roof during their initial search, and the doors were locked and alarmed. To get to the roof without triggering the siren, someone would have had to navigate a complex labyrinth of fire escapes on the exterior of the building, climbing up several stories in the pitch-black night. Furthermore, the water tanks were towering structures. There was no fixed ladder leading from the concrete roof to the top of the specific tank where she was found. To look inside, you had to climb onto a platform, then haul yourself up the slippery, curved metal side of the tank. Once at the top, you had to lift a heavy metal hatch. Inside the tank, police found the red hoodie, the shirt, and the shorts Elisa had been wearing in the elevator video. They were floating in the water alongside her. The public immediately suspected murder. It seemed physically impossible for a petite young woman to navigate the fire escapes, scale an 8-foot water tank, open a heavy metal lid, strip off her clothes, jump into the water, and somehow close the heavy lid behind her. It seemed obvious that someone had chased her down the hallway, murdered her, carried her to the roof, and dumped her body into the tank to hide the evidence. The medical examiner took weeks to conduct a thorough autopsy and toxicology report. When the results were finally released, they provided an explanation that was far more tragic and realistically terrifying than any ghost story or murder plot. The autopsy revealed 0 evidence of physical trauma. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no signs of a struggle, and no defensive wounds. Furthermore, the toxicology report came back completely clean. There were no illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. However, the toxicology report did reveal something incredibly important. The levels of her prescribed medication in her bloodstream were extremely low. Elisa Lam suffered from severe bipolar disorder. Her condition required strict, daily medication to keep her brain chemistry balanced. When she traveled to Los Angeles, the change in routine, the stress of traveling alone, or perhaps a personal decision led her to stop taking her medication as prescribed. When a person with severe bipolar disorder stops taking their medication, they can fall into a deep, psychotic, manic episode. During these episodes, the brain begins to misfire. The person can experience vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a complete break from reality. They might believe they are being hunted. They might believe they have to hide. The haunting elevator video was not a recording of a woman interacting with a ghost or a killer. It was a tragic recording of a young woman trapped inside a terrifying hallucination created by her own mind. The reason the elevator doors did not close was not due to an invisible presence. In her frantic button pressing, she had hit the door hold button, which forces the elevator to stay open for 2 minutes. She was waving her hands and talking to a threat that felt entirely real to her, but existed only in her fractured consciousness. In a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled terror, she fled the elevator. She navigated the confusing hallways of the Cecil Hotel. She found an open window or a fire escape door that bypassed the roof alarms. Driven by the intense delusion that she needed to hide from her unseen pursuers, she climbed the exterior of the building. She scaled the water tank. She opened the heavy lid and climbed into the water, seeking the ultimate hiding spot. Once she was inside the tank, the water was freezing cold. Hypothermia sets in very quickly in dark, cold water. As the body core temperature drops dangerously low, people often experience a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing. The brain becomes so confused by the cold that it suddenly registers extreme burning heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off their clothes in a desperate attempt to cool down. She removed her clothes. But the most terrifying realization of all was the water level. When she entered the tank, it was likely over half full. But the tank was essentially a giant metal barrel with smooth, slippery walls. There was no ladder on the inside. As the morning approached and the hotel guests woke up, they began to turn on their sinks and take their showers. As they used the water level inside the tank slowly began to drop. Elisa would have been treading water in the pitch-black darkness, shivering uncontrollably. As the water level sank lower and lower, the opening at the top of the tank moved further and further out of her reach. Her fingers would have scraped desperately against the slick metal walls, finding absolutely nothing to hold on to. She was trapped in an echoing, freezing, dark metal cylinder, screaming for help that would never come, until sheer exhaustion finally pulled her beneath the surface. The lid on top of the tank was likely never closed behind her. The initial reports of the maintenance worker finding the lid closed were corrected during the investigation. He had found the lid open exactly as she had left it when she climbed inside. The story of the Cecil Hotel and Elisa Lam leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a profound tragedy that strips away the comforting myths of monsters and ghosts, replacing them with the raw, devastating reality of mental illness. It teaches us a subtle, vital lesson about the immense vulnerability of the human condition. A person can be completely surrounded by hundreds of people in a massive hotel located in the middle of one of the most populated cities on Earth and still be entirely, hopelessly alone. It reminds us that the darkest, most terrifying places are not always found in the basements of old buildings or at the end of unlit hallways. Sometimes, the most inescapable prisons are built inside our own minds, waiting quietly for a moment of imbalance to lock the doors. Life requires us to be truly observant, to look past the surface of those around us, because we never know the terrifying battles someone might be fighting in the quiet isolation of their own reality. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. In the world of content creation, there is a common saying that you are only ever as good as your last video. For a 24-year-old man named Jackson Reed, this was not just a catchy phrase or a bit of industry advice. It was a complete and total obsession that governed every single waking moment of his life. Jackson was the creator and host of a moderately successful YouTube channel called Urban Decay. His brand was built on high-energy explorations of the darkest and most forgotten corners of the Pacific Northwest. He would hike miles into the wilderness or crawl through rusted chain-link fences to show his audience abandoned hospitals, shuttered asylums, and Cold War-era bunkers that had been left to rot for decades. For a few years, he was on top of the world, but by the summer of 2025, Jackson began to notice a terrifying trend in his analytics. His numbers were starting to dip. The audience was getting bored with the same old shots of rusty gurneys and peeling wallpaper. They were demanding something more. They wanted something real, a scare that they could not explain away with wind or settling floorboards. And Jackson was willing to do almost anything to give it to them. Before we get into the heavy details of what happened on that night in August, I want to take a second to ask where you are all hanging out today. Whether you are at home in the suburbs or tucked away in a cabin somewhere deep in the woods, go ahead and drop your city or town in the comments below. On a humid Friday in late August, Jackson decided he was going to take a gamble that would either resurrect his dying channel or end it forever. He had spent weeks poring over old property records and local legends until he found a lead on an undocumented sanatorium hidden deep in the dense forests outside of Spokane, Washington. The locals referred to the place as Blackwood Manor, a massive stone structure that had been abruptly closed down in 1964 following a series of unexplained and devastating fires. Jackson knew that a simple recorded video would not be enough this time. He wanted to do a full live broadcast. He wanted his viewers to see every shadow in real time and hear every creak exactly as he did, so there could be no accusations of clever editing or fake scares. Jackson arrived at the overgrown edge of the Blackwood property at exactly 11:45 p.m. He was heavily geared up for the night, carrying a high-end gimbal for smooth camera work, a powerful satellite hotspot strapped to his backpack to ensure a steady signal, and a pair of industrial-grade flashlights that could cut through decades of darkness. He stood before the looming, charred silhouette of the manor and hit the Go Live button on his phone at exactly midnight. Within seconds, notifications pinged across the globe, and over 4,000 people were suddenly watching him from the safety of their homes. The chat was scrolling so fast he could barely keep up with the sea of fire emojis and messages of encouragement. The only entrance into Blackwood was a jagged, tooth-like hole in the basement wall where the stone had crumbled away. As Jackson crawled through the opening, the temperature did not just drop, it plummeted. Even though the Washington night was thick with humidity, Jackson saw his own breath forming small, frantic puffs of mist in the air. He panned the camera around, illuminating the charred remains of wooden chairs and the carpet of shattered glass that covered the floor like ice. For the first 40 minutes, it felt like a standard exploration. He narrated the history of the facility, pointed out the disturbing graffiti on the walls, and joked with his audience to keep the energy high. But then, at approximately 12:42 a.m., the tone of the chat began to shift in a way that Jackson had never seen before. People were no longer just saying hello or asking where he was. A user with a completely blank profile picture and the generic name Viewer1 started typing very specific and very commanding instructions. This user told Jackson to turn left at the end of the long hallway he was currently walking down. Jackson laughed it off for the camera, playing it up as a bit of fun. But then another user typed that there was something standing directly behind him in the reflection of a cracked mirror he had just walked past. Jackson felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He spun the camera back toward the mirror, but there was nothing there but the reflection of his own flashlight and the empty, dark doorway. However, the chat was absolutely blowing up. Thousands of people claimed they saw a tall, thin figure with no face ducking into a room just as Jackson turned around. He felt a genuine prickle of fear on the back of his neck, the kind that your body gives you when you are being hunted. He looked down at the viewer count and saw it had jumped to over 12,000 people. The numbers were climbing faster than they ever had in the history of his channel. He knew he could not stop now. He was finally giving them exactly what they wanted. He decided to follow the instructions of the chat, letting them become his eyes and ears in the dark. It felt like a high-stakes game, but as he reached the third floor, which had once been the high security ward, the air began to smell of old copper and wet ash. Viewer 1 typed a final message that stopped Jackson dead in his tracks. The user told him that if he really wanted to see the truth of Blackwood Manor, he had to go to room 309 and lock himself inside. Jackson stood in the center of the third-floor hallway, the heavy silence of the high security ward pressing against his eardrums like deep water. The instructions from the user, known as Viewer 1, were flickering on his phone screen, a digital command that seemed to carry more weight than the physical walls around him. He looked at the heavy steel door of room 309, which featured a small, rusted slide opening once used to pass food to the dangerously ill. It looked less like a medical room and more like a tomb designed to keep something in rather than help it get well. The chat was a frantic, blurred stream of text, with thousands of people calling him a coward and threatening to unsubscribe if he did not go through with the challenge. Driven by a desperate need to keep his viewer count climbing and to prove he was still the king of urban exploration, Jackson reached out and grabbed the cold iron handle. He stepped into the tiny room, and the heavy door swung shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach churn. The latch clicked into place, a sound that echoed through the small space like a gunshot. He panned his camera around, showing the 12,000 viewers the interior of the room. It was completely empty, except for a single, weathered wooden stool sitting in the far corner. Jackson sat down on the stool, trying to keep his breathing steady for the broadcast. He checked his phone and noticed something technically impossible. Despite being deep within a structure made of thick stone and reinforced steel, his signal was perfect. In fact, it was better than it had been outside. He looked at the chat, expecting to see the usual chaos, but the screen had gone completely silent. No one was typing. The viewer count was frozen at 18,404. The digital world seemed to have stopped breathing right along with him. Then, at exactly 1:26 a.m., the screen on his phone began to flicker violently, the colors bleeding and distorting until the live feed changed entirely. Jackson realized with a jolt of horror that he was no longer looking at the selfie view of his own face. He was looking at a video of himself sitting on the wooden stool, but the camera angle was from the high ceiling corner of the room. He slowly looked up, his heart hammering against his ribs, but there was no camera in the corner. There was nothing but cracked plaster and shadows. He rushed to the door and grabbed the handle, pulling with everything he had, but it would not budge. He began to yell for help, but his own voice sounded muffled and distant to his ears, as if he were shouting from underwater. He looked back down at the phone in his trembling hands. The chat had returned, but the messages were no longer coming from human beings. The screen was filled with long strings of binary code and distorted symbols that defied any known language. In the live feed on his screen, Jackson watched as the door to the room began to open slowly. But as he looked at the physical door in front of him, it remained tightly shut and locked. He watched his own digital image on the screen stand up from the stool and walk out of the room into the dark, charred hallway of the sanatorium. The digital version of Jackson then turned back toward the camera and smiled. It was a smile that was far too wide for a human face, revealing rows of teeth that looked like jagged glass. Jackson felt a wave of pure, unadulterated terror wash over him. as he realized he had finally found the real scare his audience had been demanding. He had spent so many years performing for a screen, chasing the approval of people he had never met, that the digital world had finally decided to take the performer and leave the man behind. He began to scream, pounding his fists against the reinforced steel door, but the sound did not even produce an echo in the small, oppressive room. He thought about his brother, whom he had pushed away because he thought the channel was more important than family. He thought about the sincerity he had traded for likes and shares, realizing too late that the 18,000 people watching were not his friends. They were spectators at an execution, and he had been the one to provide the rope. At exactly 2:10 a.m., the battery on his high-end phone finally died. The screen went black, and with it, the only source of light in the room vanished, leaving Jackson in a darkness so absolute that he could no longer tell where his body ended and the room began. Back in the city, at the local police station, a frantic call came in at 4:45 a.m. from Jackson's roommate. The roommate had been watching the stream and had seen the feed cut to a horrifying, static image of Jackson's face before the entire channel was deleted from the platform. The authorities were able to track the GPS signal from his backpack to the woods outside Spokane. They found his car parked at the edge of the property, its tires sunk deep into the mud from the late summer rain. When the search party entered Blackwood Manor, they made their way to the 3rd floor. They found his backpack and his gimbal lying on the floor right outside the door to room 309. The heavy steel door was closed, the latch firmly in place. The lead officer took a deep breath and pulled the door open, expecting to find Jackson huddling in the corner. But as the beam of his flashlight swept across the small space, his breath hitched in his throat. The room was completely empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the thick dust, and no Jackson Reed. The only thing they found was a single smartphone lying in the exact center of the floor. Its screen cracked and charred, as if it had been through an intense fire. The lead officer stood in the doorway of room 309, his breathing heavy and ragged as the beam of his flashlight cut through the thick, swirling dust. The space was so small that he could reach out and touch both walls simultaneously, yet it felt as cavernous and cold as a tomb. There was no way out, no windows, and the stone walls were solid, showing no signs of secret passages or structural failure. He looked down at the charred smartphone in the center of the floor. Despite the intense heat that must have been required to melt the casing and blacken the screen, there was not a single scorch mark on the floorboards beneath it. It was as if the fire had come from inside the device itself. The tech forensics team at the Spokane precinct worked for 3 days straight to recover any data from the ruined hardware. When they finally managed to pull the final 30 seconds of the recorded livestream, the entire department gathered around a single monitor in a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. They did not see Jackson being attacked or dragged away. Instead, they saw the view from the corner of the room, looking down at Jackson as he sat on the stool. In the video, the real Jackson was still pounding on the door, his movements frantic and desperate. But then, the door in the video slowly creaked open. A hand reached in from the hallway to pull the door shut from the outside. The hand had 5 fingers, but the skin was not flesh. It was the shifting, flickering color of digital static. As the door in the video clicked shut, the camera panned down to the smartphone lying on the floor. For a brief second, the reflection in the dark screen showed the room was completely full. It was packed with thousands of translucent, flickering figures, all standing shoulder to shoulder, staring down at Jackson with wide, unblinking eyes. They were not there to help him. They were there to consume the moment. The video ended with a single line of text appearing in the chat box from a user with no name. It simply said that the performance was finally satisfactory. Jackson Reed was officially declared a missing person on September 3, 2025, but the case remains one of the most disturbing anomalies in the history of the department. There were no tracks leading away from the sanatorium, and no body was ever recovered from the woods. However, the most unsettling part of the story did not happen at the manor. It happened on the internet. A week after the search was called off, the Urban Decay channel suddenly reappeared online. All of the old videos had been deleted, replaced by a single 24-hour looped live stream of an empty stone room. To this day, if you find that channel and look at the viewer count, it never changes. It is always frozen at 18,404. If you stay on the stream for more than 10 minutes, your own device will begin to run hot, the battery draining in a matter of seconds. Some people claim that if you turn the volume up all the way and filter out the white noise, you can hear the faint, muffled sound of a man pounding on a steel door, his voice hoarse from months of screaming. Others say that if you look closely at the shadows in the corner of the stream, you can see a pair of eyes reflecting the blue light of a screen that never turns off. The hunger for validation is a flame that eventually consumes the very person who fans it, leaving nothing but cold ash in its wake. We often spend our lives building a digital version of ourselves to show the world, forgetting that when we step too far into the light of the screen, we leave our shadows behind to find a life of their own. It is a strange thing to realize that we are the only ones who can truly witness our own lives. When we trade that private reality for the hollow gaze of 1,000 strangers, we might just find that the audience eventually decides to keep the show running long after the performer has disappeared.